Hello, it's Scott Manley here. It is the 31st of December 2019, the end of a decade. Unless, of course, you're one of those people that uses the ones to start their decade. I totally understand. I used to program Fortran, but now I program C, so this is the end of the decade as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, yeah, I want to talk about, how much has changed in the last 10 years. Obviously, for me, I've gone from, no viewers to almost a million, maybe a million by the time you watch this, which is very cool. I've gone from playing video games to talking about real space and science. But yeah, in the space world, well, let's see what happened there. First of all, the big, SpaceX has been one of the big success stories. In 2010, they had launched 5 Falcon 1s by that point, and only 2 of them had been successful. 2010 saw the first launch of the Falcon 9, and it was ultimately successful. And by the end of the decade, they've launched something like 80 Falcon 9s, including the Falcon Heavy. Now, at this point, they're still sort of lagging behind over the whole decade with the ULA, which had 62 Atlas 5s and about 29 Delta 4s, and there was some Delta 2s as well. But I think at this rate, they're definitely becoming very likely the number one launcher in the US in the next decade. Having said that, this is a worldwide stage. Russia is still, eclipsing the US launch rate, and China has gone from launching about 60 rockets in the noughties to launching 200 rockets in the last decade. India has also tripled their output as well. But SpaceX has also managed to do something that no other launch provider has. They have managed to cultivate a fan base. And while there's definitely people that are proud of the rockets from all over other countries, the fan base of SpaceX seems to go beyond straight-up nationalistic patriotism. Many of them just love the idea of Elon Musk, wanting to put people on Mars. And, regardless of how realistic that is or the timescales of that, I think it's fabulous to watch people getting really excited over all these launches, and especially looking forward to Starship and, straight up describing it as the beginning of the future. And I hope it is. I hope we see it in the next decade changing everything. The decade also saw the final flight of a number of classic pieces of space hardware. Most prominently, the Space Shuttle brought to an end its 30-year career in July of 2011. The Delta II had its last flight in 2018. The Delta II was the last of the Deltas derived from the Thor rocket of the 1950s. Over in Russia, there was a number of projects that were in collaboration with Ukraine, sort of the Zenit rocket and the Rokot, which had Ukrainian guidance hardware. Obviously, these have gone into sort of hiatus due to political problems. And also in the US, the Pegasus XL, the first air-launched orbital launch vehicle, it's probably had its last launch in the last couple of months. It's not officially cancelled, it's just that I can't see anyone buying a launch on it anytime soon, or ever for that matter. It's also been a decade in which the US lost its human launch capability and has had to use Soyuz launches for pretty much the last 9 years. And yeah, there's a lot of news articles from bad news sources that try to blame President Bush or President Obama, but truth is, this has much more to do with the politics of the House and the Senate looking out for their states rather than the needs of NASA. Anyway, on the astronomy side of things, I think the biggest event of the decade has been LIGO discovering gravity waves, and not just discovering them and showing that they exist, but turning it into an actual science, being able to make multiple observations. They're finding them regularly, and they're able to now use these to target other observations. The first event was observed in September 2015, and that was a pair of black holes. But later they found a neutron star collision and got all the telescopes all over the world to point at it. We saw a flare afterwards, and now we understand where all sorts of heavy elements come from that we didn't previously. Another big space astronomy story was the Event Horizon telescope producing the highest resolution image of black holes using very long baseline interferometry and submillimeter waves. And this was really, really cool, but I don't think it had the same effect on the moment as the LIGO discovery. We're still sort of interpreting these results, and they're not telling us that much. More interesting, I think, right now is the recent NICER telescope that has been showing us more details about the surface of neutron stars. We're now getting a much better idea of the equation of state of neutronium and how compact objects evolve. And this has much wider ranging effects for the evolution of the universe. The last decade also saw an explosion in the number of exoplanets. Previously, there were small numbers that were discovered. There were hot Jupiters sitting very close to their parent stars, but now we have thousands of exoplanet candidates. We're able to do statistics, and we're able to find objects that are roughly the mass of the Earth sitting at a distance from the star which is not incompatible with liquid water. So while Kepler started observing in 2009, most of the results came in the last decade. And of course, now we're looking at future missions or current missions which are going to provide even more data across other parts of the night sky. I think the most exciting space mission of the decade was probably New Horizons. It brought Pluto into focus. It showed us that it was a living, breathing world, not a frozen, snowball on the edge of the solar system. We also saw its moons, we saw Charon, and then of course, a couple of years later, it flew past MU-69, also known as Ultima Thule, now known as Arrokoth. And these things, they gave us a window into the very edge of our solar system. Also should be noted, beyond the edge of our solar system, Voyagers 1 and 2 have been confirmed to have gone off into interstellar space. It took a while to transition across the boundary. The boundary moved because it was a turbulent transition between the solar wind and the interstellar medium. And so Voyager 1 and 2, 40 years on, they're still providing really interesting information and data on how the outer edges of the solar system transition to the rest of the universe. Closer in, there was another couple of missions which spent a great deal more time next to small solar system bodies. Dawn was originally launched in 2007 and it arrived at Vesta in 2011 and perused this small world for a couple of years before moving on to Ceres, and it remains around Ceres right now. It showed that these aren't just rocks in the asteroid belt, they're worlds unto themselves with geological activity. And after 10 years in flight, Rosetta arrived at Comet 67P Churyumov-Gerasimenko, always mess that up. In 2014, it launched a lander onto the surface, which unfortunately didn't work too well. But with Rosetta, we got to ride along with a comet as it flew in from the cold outer reaches of the solar system, swung past the sun, and then back off into deep space once again. Those are all my favourite missions, but we had ongoing exploration of Mars with the Curiosity rover replacing the Opportunity. We've had Mars HiRISE, orbiter. There's the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. We've had a couple of attempts to land on the moon, which have failed. We had the successful landing on the far side of the moon by Chang'e 4. And we also had the Messenger spacecraft orbiting Mercury and getting the first global maps of that planet. There's Parker Solar Probe, which as of a few days ago just made a second gravity assist past Venus to drop its perihelion even lower towards the Sun. And there's OSIRIS-REx orbiting Bennu and Hayabusa that has just left Ryugu. On the other hand, some of the most important events of the decade weren't things that we had to go to, they were things that came to us. Notably, the Chelyabinsk bolide, which flew over, shattered windows, injured thousands of people, but thankfully killed nobody. It was a pretty landmark demonstration of small-scale dangers that can happen from natural meteorite impacts. And during the decade, we found the first two interstellar objects. Oumuamua was the first. It was enigmatic. It was tiny. We never resolved any cometary activity on it, and yet its orbit changed as if it were a comet. It probably has very strange elongated shape. The other object was 2I Borisov, and so far Borisov has been straight down the middle, a regular comet. It hasn't looked like it's different from any other long period comet. Obviously we're working from a sample size of 2, but we've known that these objects must be out there and we haven't been finding them. So this has been A great validation of our understanding of the universe. So yeah, that was the last decade. I thought it was a pretty good one, and I'm hoping that the coming decade is going to be great too. We've got Mars 2020 to look forward to. Dragonfly will launch. The Artemis program may or may not get people to the moon, but I hope we see continued activity. I hope the SLS actually flies, and I hope that Starship is able to prove that it is able to fly to orbit and back and be 100% reusable, because that would be a transformative moment in human spaceflight capability. I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.